my name is Allison, and I will introduce our final keynote speaker of Design Nation. Mila Linares is a brand strategist with global experience in nonprofit, tech, and payment industries. She started off her career in management consulting. A couple years ago, she worked as the design strategy lead for Wolff Olins New York, and currently she is the head of brand development at Unicef. We will be taking audience Q&A, so please submit your questions through the Slido. Without further ado, please welcome Mila Linares.
Thank you, Allison. I think I can move my slides here just super quickly. So thank you for having me. It's amazing to be here today with so many future design leaders. Thank you for having me. I wanted to talk to you today a little bit about myself and my career, and talk a little bit about sort of my journey to brand. It wasn't always obvious that I was going to end up working in brand, and I was chatting with a lot of you and what you're studying now and your sort of hopes and dreams for the future. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my career. So I'm a brand strategist, but I was originally in management consulting when I finished college. And then I went over to market research. And I now work at Unicef, which is the United Nations Children's Fund. And in a nutshell, I love to simplify the complex, and I love to, deliver work that has clarity, that has meaning, and that has impact. And that's why I love working with designers. They're always my favorite collaborators in any job that I've had. So the theme of this conversation is transformation, which I find really, really inspirational, and I love the theme of it. So I thought of it sort of in three different ways. First is like the transformation of my career, when I was more or less your age to my position right now. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the transformation of brand. Yes?
Now? Hello, everybody. Thank you for your patience. We are getting a better microphone so you guys are able to hear Mila better. And yeah, so please be patient. Thank you so much.
Okay, I'm back. I feel like an astronaut right now, but maybe you guys can hear me better. So I'm going to talk about my career, my transformation, if you will, from caterpillar to butterfly, perhaps. I'm going to talk about the transformation that I've seen in the field of brand at very high level since I started, because obviously things have changed a lot and are continuing to change every day. And then I'm going to talk about two projects that have transformed the way I think about not only brand, but also the world. And that's been my work while I was at Wolff Olins for the Wikimedia Foundation, and my current role at Unicef. And then I'm super happy to take your questions, so keep me on time so that I don't go over. So I thought it would be good to start with an embarrassing picture of myself. So here I am around 1997, perhaps, really dating myself here. But this is the incoming class for Accenture. The first person to spot me in this picture gets a t-shirt. But I studied business and economics. So it was very natural for me to go to management consulting. I had a class my senior year that was business strategy, and I loved it. I thought it was so interesting, and it was kind of like a great way to understand how things work. So I did that for a few years, learned a lot, but it wasn't really my thing. And then I read a book, and that book really changed my life. The book was Corporate Identity, and it was written by this gentleman that you see here, Wolff Olins, who many would say is the father, if you will, of the practice of branding. He was the first person to really speak about branding as a thing. And many, many years after I read that book, I actually got to work with Wally, which was amazing. And I learned a lot from him. He was, what was really amazing about Wally, I think, is that he was not formulaic. He was not about methodology. He was a lot more a school of thought, a way of approaching problems, which I think is much more interesting and definitely has much more longevity because things change all the time. So one of my favorite things that Wally would say and that I feel holds true, and anyone who's ever worked with me has heard me say this many, many times, branding makes business strategy visible. And what that means is that whenever you look at, for example, it's very clear in brand architecture, when you look at a portfolio of brands, you can really tell a lot about the organization, what it values, the way it takes decisions, where it's heading to. So for me, branding was so interesting because it brought together things that were kind of different, but that I'm very passionate about. So business strategy, insights, design, all of these things come together in branding, and that's what it makes it such an interesting field to work in. He would, for Wally, everything was about the big idea, if you will, or the central idea. And that's a role that typically strategists play in a branding job. Sometimes I would say also designers have a huge role in it, and there are plenty of studios that don't have strategists. So it's a role that kind of like a lot of people play it, but he would say that ideas need to be big, simple, and true. And they need to be big enough to serve to future-proof your business or your organization. They need to be simple so that everybody understands them, and that's particularly important when you work on a global brand. And they have to be true so that you can continue to deliver on it. You can't sort of fake it. You have to be true to who you are as an organization. And today I will show you a couple of, both in Wikipedia and for Unicef, I'll show you our brand ideas and why I think they're big, simple, and true. So he would also say that, and he would talk a lot about brands as people. And it's really important to understand as a brand who you are authentically. And really, just like a person, whatever you stand for is what's going to make you stand out. So there's a lot of soul searching in brand strategy, which is really about getting to the heart of what the organization is, the essence, and kind of like owning that and communicating it with a lot of clarity. So these are very simple, things, but that I keep going back to them because I feel like they have so much power to them. So the world has changed a ton since I started in brand, and it continues to change every day. And over the past 2 years, we've all seen how much our lives have changed, how much the way we even eat or study or work has changed so much. And I'm going to be a little bit reductive, but I want to talk to you about sort of a major shift that I see in the field of brand. I think when I started, and apologies for the very unpleasant image, but if we take a step back, the origin of the word brand, and I'm sure you guys know this, is literally to brand cattle, right? So it was about ownership. And I think there was a time and a place when, brand was often passive. It was sort of tightly controlled because organizations were very centralized, and it was rigid. So I think when I go back in time, and I think all the work we did on print, for example, where it had to be just a specific way, and that's it, you couldn't change it. I think brand at that time was more passive and more rigid. The way that I think about brand now is much more like a forest. So I think, if you think about, everybody's a content creator now. Things are constantly changing, and realign and we must understand our audiences very, very deeply. So it's a little bit like a forest. I think about brand has to be much more of a system that is connected and that really is looking to lift all the trees in the forest, if you will, and to sort of like grow in a certain harmony. So it's much more organic. And I think brands today need to be more active, they need to be more engaging, and they need to be more communal. They kind of belong to everyone. And especially when you think about nonprofit or cultural institutions, you know, the brands that we create, the systems, are much more in the hands of the people that we serve than in the for-profit sector. So another way to think about brand and sort of the role of the brand strategist that I love, and I'm always kind of like, you know, pushing my teams to think this way, is that, you know, brand is really all about your future. And this is the way that, you know, Robert Jones, who I also had the pleasure to work with at Wolff Olins, talks about brand. You know, it's about thinking about your next generation of supporters, in our case, and a next generation of donors. And oftentimes, as a brand strategist, you know, my role has been to help organizations look at their future and to think, how are you going to connect with this new wave of people who you have to be relevant for? So if you really own your brand, you know, you could say that you're going to keep your people committed, it's going to keep your doors open, and it's going to keep your rivals far away. So I love the idea of brand as your future, and I love playing the role as a strategist of helping organizations think about their future through the eyes of the people they serve. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of projects, Wikipedia while I was at Wolff Olins, and I'm going to talk to you about my current role at Unicef, which is, you know, very, very, very interesting. So if I were to do a job kind of like every day in a Groundhog Day manner, I think it would be Wikimedia, because I learned so much, and it's a job that gave me so much. So I was leading the strategy team at Wolff Olins here in New York with an amazing team of designers, strategists, account managers. And we got in, you know, we won the pitch to work with the Wikimedia Foundation, which is the foundation that holds Wikipedia and a bunch of other projects. And the ask was really a strategy ask. And what they were looking to do was to invite a new generation of contributors. Their vision is that by 2030, they want to be the sum of all human knowledge. And after a huge internal consultation around the world, they realized that their editor base was not diversified at all, and it was very much concentrated in the global north. So what this meant for us is that we needed to find a way to simplify the brand architecture of the Wikimedia Foundation, and also find sort of the language and the proposition so that we could communicate very clearly and distinctively what Wikimedia is. So my role there was really to lead the research, to lead the formulation of the strategy, and really to lead the team in the creation of this new brand architecture, a new brand strategy, and a new brand idea for the Wikimedia Foundation. So I want to just acknowledge, before I show you all, you know, some of the work, that there was a huge team effort behind this. You know, nothing is achieved alone. And our client was incredible, Heather and Zach from the Wikimedia Foundation, and the design and strategy team at Wolff Olins was remarkable throughout this whole project. So really a huge, huge team effort and a huge multidisciplinary effort. So the first thing we did, it was a 6-month collaboration, and this project really took us all over the world, and I hope all of you have the experience to do something like this, because it was remarkable. And we worked really, really closely with our clients. Everything that we did, we workshopped with them, we debated with them. We tried to work very quickly and to put ideas in front of them so that they could give us their feedback. And there's just a few snapshots from this project here. We got to go to Wikimania, which is the annual conference for Wikipedia in Cape Town in South Africa. And we got to meet people from all over the world. I'm not sure if everyone knows, but Wikipedia is a volunteer-run movement. So each country has a chapter, and in each country it's very different. Each country has sort of almost like a different remit. So it was fascinating to just, interview people from so many parts of the world. We also got to work with the board. There's a picture there of Jimmy Wales, who's the founder of Wikipedia, who we got to interview. And we got to workshop really, really hard with the whole client team. So it was a very collaborative effort. And it was really my first role always as a strategist is to try and understand the organization and to cull it down to like sort of its basics. So we ran a really large global research where we tried to understand, for example, what the word Wikimedia meant to people. And what we found very quickly is that the word Wikimedia was not known, and people didn't really know about it, and they thought it was Wikipedia with video. There were a lot more findings from this research, but that was kind of like very eye-opening and a great thing to put in front of like the client team. So with that in mind, we built a whole sort of like various options for the brand architecture. And we started with this very simple argument, which was about, talking first to the movement and then to the board about how the organization is going to grow, and really looking at where the internet is going to grow in the next, 10, 15 years. And helping them see that even though Wikipedia was such a strong brand in the global north, there were lots of countries that were starting to, join the internet. There were a lot of young people who didn't know about it. So we had to make it as simple as possible. And we built this argument just kind of saying like, well, it's an amazing organization, but it's very hard to tell from the outside. And you're losing, mind share to players that have a very, very clear and sort of systematic entry point. Players like Google, like Facebook, like YouTube. In a lot of countries, people experience the internet first through Facebook. I'm sure you know that. So we wanted to just make sure that we were presenting something that was as clear as possible. And this is very much like, I feel like I'm in a cooking show where, I'm presenting a souffle and it looks perfect, but there was a lot of work to get here. So we had this idea that was, thinking about, we know we are Wikimedia, but people know us for Wikipedia. And we want to talk about all these other fascinating projects like Wikidata, Wikicommons, Wiktionary. So we built this whole argument about shortening the distance and really starting to have Wikipedia as the leading brand. This was our proposal for the future state of the brand. And you'll see that there's a brand and then there's all these projects underneath it. So we tried to present a very simplified brand architecture that would help people understand the project very quickly, and that would lean towards the brand that had the highest global recognition, which is Wikipedia, which is a brand that we all know. And then we worked on this brand idea that I was talking about earlier from, back when I was talking about Wally. And there was something about the idea of freedom that's very unique to Wikipedia. So Wikipedia is a platform that is free from political, commercial, and any type of interest. It's truly free, and that idea of freedom we thought was very important. For example, a big part of the Wikimedia project is Wikidata that makes knowledge available to all platforms. Like, for example, platforms like Alexa, they are powered by Wikidata. So this idea of setting knowledge free became like the vision for Wikipedia, again, after lots and lots of research and work and getting this to a very, very tight sentence. We worked on this narrative, which was incredibly fun to put together, and it was brought to life visually in an amazing way. And it really it's the origin story. It tells a whole story about why does Wikipedia exist, what does it do, where are we heading, what are the obstacles that we are facing. And it was a sort of a remarkable moment to see the movement and the board really rally behind it. Here is the whole narrative. We won't get into it, but it was incredible. And a great exercise at distilling everything that Wikipedia is and can be for people. And then, I think this is relevant for this audience, we also worked very, very closely with our design team, who were remarkable, not only in all of these executions, but really shaping the brand architecture, the brand narrative. They were instrumental. But I think something that was really, we did with a lot of heart in that project was try to help people overcome the fear of such a big change. And we tried to help them visualize what it could look like. So these are some ideas that we put in front of the team to help them visualize what Wikipedia could look like. So here are just some examples of how the brand could show up in different ways. And we really wanted to make them look at the future and see what Wikipedia could be in the future. So these were just some really fun executions on what Wikipedia for children could be like, and our favorite sort of Wikipedia in the metaverse. So a really, really incredible exercise in helping our clients understand what Wikipedia could look like in the future. And just to pause a little bit on Wikipedia, it was truly transformational for me. I think all of us who worked on that project, it really transformed the way we think about the world, really. When you realize that I think it's 70% of the content on the internet is in English, but 70% of the world does not speak English. The importance of having representation and all of this knowledge on a platform like Wikipedia is remarkable. So it made us think so much about, sort of positive change and what that could look like. And I think also for me, I've always been a big believer, but it really cemented the idea of design to help you overcome change and to help people visualize the opportunity. Changing a brand architecture, changing messaging, it can be very scary for people. So design helped us visualize what the opportunity could look like, and that's something that I think as designers you get to do all the time, and it's fascinating. But Wikipedia really ignited for me this curiosity that I've had for many years about branding in the nonprofit sector. What would that look like, and what's the contribution that branding can make? And I think we all agree that the world is a hot mess. So I wanted to, orient my next steps towards a nonprofit institution, and that's how I got to Unicef, which is where I work right now. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about Unicef. I'm going to talk to you about our brand, our history, and kind of what it's teaching me. So I want to make sure that I leave time for questions, though. So I'll try to go through this a little bit quicker. So UNICEF is the United Nations Children's Fund. We are in 190 countries, and we support children from birth until they're 18. So it's a very wide remit. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about, our history, which I think is interesting. Then about our logo, because it tells a great story about, branding making strategy visible. And then I'm going to talk for a second about World Children's Day and what my team, how my team supports that vision. So this is an artifact from our past, from 1946. So UNICEF was founded as a temporary relief agency in the aftermath of World War II. And it was meant to help children and mothers who were, displaced by World War II. And this is from our first executive director, and I really love this story. I think it tells a lot about the organization. He accepted, the job of being the first executive director on one condition, and the condition was that UNICEF was meant to help all children and not just the children of the countries that had won the war. So his quote that he's very famous for in the organization is that there's no enemy children. And it really speaks a lot to the ethos of the organization that continues to work across all sorts of countries, in all sorts of situations. And it's this belief that, all children have these rights that must be realized. And that's really at the heart of the organization. So it's a very ambitious organization in the best way possible. So this is a little bit of our timeline, and all the things that, the sort of the progression, the transformation, if you will, from relief to an organization that is really based on equity today. And just like, the organization has been transformed, so has our logo, and it tells a great story. It tells a great story about transformation and about adaptation and growth. So from our 1946 logo with the UN Relief and Rehabilitation Agency to our first logo where it's literally a kid with a glass of milk, because that was a lot of our first programs in Europe, to the first image of the caregiver, and there you see it evolve all the way. You start seeing language around Unite for Children or equity, et cetera, et cetera. Which brings us to our current, before I go to our current logo, I just wanted to pull up some examples that we found in our archives. We recently celebrated our 75th anniversary. But what I wanted to talk to you guys for a second is how innovative I think UNICEF has been from the beginning in trying to keep children at the top of the global agenda. And we've had contributions from so many amazing artists and writers and people over the decades. So a very innovative organization from the beginning. This is our logo today. It was created in 2016. And you'll notice this tagline at the bottom of it, for every child, and that's our brand idea. In our case, our brand idea is our tagline. And it was really born out of a very sort of deep reflection. In 2016, the organization looked at the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. And while we could see that we had done fantastic gains in a lot of fields, there were huge gaps in when it came to the most vulnerable children. So children with disabilities, girls, there were all sorts of pockets of populations that were not getting their fair start in life. So that's what For Every Child encompasses in a very everyday eloquence. It's our commitment to equity and our commitment to realizing the rights of all children wherever they may be. It has a beautiful modularity, from a brand system perspective, and in a very simple way, it allows us to talk about all the many, many things that we're present in. So another thing that's I love about our brand system is that it's localized via our tagline. So we are one brand, UNICEF, but then each country localizes a tagline in their local languages. And one of the things that, for example, my team is constantly busy with is updating it to the many, many languages that we operate in. So we're up to 75 versions of the logo. And last week, I think we were working on Papiamento, which is a language that's spoken in Curaçao. So we take a lot of care as a brand. It's a truly, truly global brand. We have a presence all over the world, but each country, the positioning, the programs are completely different because the needs of children are completely different. So it's a truly global brand and something that I absolutely love. We also take a lot of care in photography, and that's possibly one of the things that I love the most about my job is whenever we need to find photography, we have a remarkable photography team. They're professional photojournalists who travel around the world, and they're always looking to capture the essence of childhood. Incredibly respectful. We have really, really defined standards on how to portray children with dignity and with respect. And the pictures are just incredible. And I think that's always the part that I enjoy the most is sourcing photography for any of our projects. And I wanted to talk to you about this idea of brand as forest, as an ecosystem, as something that works together. In the context of UNICEF and World Children's Day. And I think that will leave 15 minutes for questions. So one of the things that we work in every year as a brand is World Children's Day on November 20th. And we need to prepare a toolkit that's very simple because countries are so different, the context is so different. Some teams have really large design teams, others have no designers. So it has to work for everyone, and it has to be uniform but flexible. So we have this activity that's called Kids Takeovers, and each country interprets it in a different way. Some people, their kids go to parliament, it's really interesting. We have this other activity that's called Turning the World Blue, where we encourage countries to light up a major landmark in blue and to show their support for children. But possibly the most fun part that we work on as a team is preparing the social media kit. We have a huge digital presence, and it's an incredible channel for us. And we create this thing that's called the master visual. And the master visual, this is just one piece of it. we try to make it as simple every year and kind of create a shell that each country can customize a little bit. So the day of 20th of November, for us, it's a bit like Christmas for our team, because we have like our global templates that we create, and then we wake up and we kind of go through all the feeds and we see how all the different countries have adapted it. And it's amazing, you know, like they choose their own photos, they have, you know, messages in their own language. Some of them go a little bit off brief, like Brazil went a little bit off brief, but we kind of loved it. And it's sort of a really interesting exercise because we both have to be very, like, create a sense of consistency, of unity, but we also want to give countries the liberty to do whatever they have to do and to make a message that at the end is relevant for their country. So that's a little bit about World Children's Day, and we're going to start working on it again in May, and we kind of have gone back and we did a huge audit, and we looked at how World Children's Day looked last year, and we always want to make it a little bit better. But it's kind of like a really interesting exercise for me, because sometimes things don't look exactly like we want them to look, but sometimes they're better because they are relevant to the countries where they're operating. So I think the more that we work with the digital teams, the more that we are learning about how to create tools that are truly relevant and helpful for a huge constituency of people. So I wanted to just pause for a second and tell you a little bit about what I think my current role is teaching me, and then hand it over to any questions that you guys may have. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. I think working for Unicef is a completely different ballgame, if you will, to working in the private sector. I'm definitely loving to working with a team that's so diverse. Like, just alone in my team, I work with people from Sierra Leone, from Argentina, from Korea, from Lebanon, from Canada. So whenever we're looking at a piece of work, everybody has such different points of view. So that is incredible. And then sort of the added challenge of thinking about the many contexts in which our brand shows up. Sometimes we need to prepare, you know, material for really high-level events like Davos, for example, and the brand has to show up in a very credible and authoritative way. Sometimes we're preparing materials for an activity that's really geared towards children. So we created like a beautiful storybook last year, and it was really to be used by children. Sometimes we have to think about branding in incredibly sensitive contexts, like the current emergency in Ukraine right now. And we really have to be very thoughtful about how do we make sure that the brand is useful and it's respectful to people. So it's a constant sort of like flux in thinking about the different audiences that we're serving, and really thinking about the brand sort of in the most humble way. And it's the brand that has to be useful for people, and that ultimately has to serve our interests and our work for children. So it's a really interesting role. And then I think the third one is, as digital platforms continue to push towards performance and everything has to be measured, we're sort of in a constant reinvention of how brand needs to show up, and sort of like experimenting all the time. So that's a little bit of what sort of I find so fascinating about my role right now. And yeah, thank you so much, and super happy to chat with you and answer any questions you may have.
Lovely. Thank you so much.
Of course,
Mila.
of course.
So we are opening it to audience questions, so please ask questions in the Slido. The code is DN22. I wanted to start with the first question.
Sure.
So you talk about how you loved working at Wikimedia and how the culture was really incredible. So I'd love to hear a little bit about how you think culture inside a company interacts with the brand outside the company.
Yeah, that's a great question. I always think that that brand really starts internally, and it starts with the company, right? So whatever it is that you are true, like how you behave internally, it's ultimately what's going to transpire externally. So I think for Wikimedia, for example, like you could really see like a key tenet of their culture is transparency. All of the work that I've presented, you can actually find it online because that's what Wikimedia is all about. So for example, like every single one of their, the meetings that we had for them, like all the meetings, all the minutes would be posted immediately on a wiki page, and everybody could read them and everybody could comment on them. So for them, like that tenet of transparency, we actually made it one of the core values of our system, was clear in everything that we did. And I think, like if you're going to have a successful brand implementation, you always have to start with the internally. Like your best ambassadors are always going to be your staff. And at the end of the day, like it's how people behave every day. And it's something that I think is a really big part of an internal brand team. At Unicef, for example, like we have this initiative that's called Brand Camp. And what we do is like we hold these sessions every month. There's a huge rotation in our organization because people are meant to rotate every 5 years to a different country. So there's always new people on board, and the first thing we try to do is bring them to these sessions and really onboard them in the culture, explain to them who we are, what we do, and sort of get those first basic tools and orientation around the brand. So I think absolutely, like let's start with the brand always internally. Let's make sure that people, understand it and really use it every day and behave in a way that's truly coherent with the brand. Absolutely.
Okay, so for our next question, we have one from Cindy.
Mm-hmm.
So my question for you would be in the context of your work with Wikipedia, where a lot of the contributions are coming from individual users, or even in the context of UNICEF, where you're trying to mobilize like this grassroots network of people to combat really like tough issues that are like global in scale. How do you use strategy and branding to overcome issues of collective action and inspire a sense of personal accountability? Yeah, it's a great question. I feel like they're both very different, but for example, at UNICEF we have a lot of we have a huge advocacy pillar, and that's a lot of their focus is really to mobilize public opinion. So from the strategy perspective, I feel like we're always trying to sort of help people understand how the organization, what it is and how it's different. We're always trying to help people understand that we're not a charity, we're a child rights organization. And my colleagues in particular in advocacy have a whole sort of setup that they call, that comes from sociology, which is theory of change. And really helping people understand the problem little by little and see how they can get involved. As a brand, I would say that UNICEF always is looking to be, and that's one of sort of the underpinnings of our brand, we're always looking to show what are the possible solutions and to remain hopeful. We're always trying to give people some agency. So in short, it's kind of like it really depends on the audience, but when it comes to grassroots mobilization, for us, it's really trying to explain, why supporting children matters and really showing like the very specific, solution and the very specific program that people can support. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so our next question is going to be from Enver.
Mm-hmm.
Hello.
Hi.
So this question kind of exists at the confluence of two things you said.
Yeah.
One of them was you're, in an increasingly digital world, you're in this constant reinvention of how brand shows up.
Yeah.
And then also the reference to the quote from the first executive director, there are no enemy children. And it makes me wonder about this question of the archive, right? And how much a role, I guess the question is, what role does the origins of an institution as old as UNICEF play in an increasingly digital brand?
Yeah, wow, that's a fabulous question. I think the origin, I'm personally fascinated with the UNICEF archive and it's physical. And I want to go in there and digitize it and stuff. I think there's this really interesting sort of duality there. I think on the one hand, we're always going to go back to our origin story. It's almost like the foundation of a country, if you will. In our darkest days, in our most complicated moments, I think we always go back to that foundational idea and to the spirit of the organization and the brand. So I think, for example, in December, to give you an example, we celebrated our 75th anniversary, and we were very thoughtful about it from a brand perspective. We wanted, on the one hand, to honor our legacy and to honor our history, but we didn't want to show up as a brand that's old and that's tired. We want to also show that we are a brand that's continuously reinventing itself. So we did a couple of really interesting things from a design perspective, if you will. We created on social media like some really interesting stories we curated some of our best posters. We went back to the archives and we picked some of the best of the best. And the way that we made that, we thought we could make that relevant to today's audiences, is that we really focused on not choosing the best or the coolest but we really like this idea of equity that we think is really true to our organization and very relevant in today's world. We only chose the posters that really spoke most to the highest order idea, which is for every child, every right. So that's how we curated them. And then we brought them to life, on Instagram and on Facebook, and I think they were also on TikTok. And we gave them all to all the countries, and then the countries amplified them further. So in a way, we were able to both honor our tradition and our origins, but also deliver it in a way that was more contemporary. But it's very tricky. I feel like it's a very tricky space that we're always trying to navigate. But that was like a really fun exercise in going back to the archives and to the origin and finding things. It's a bit like, my example is always Bernie Sanders. If you're in the right side of issues for decades and you own that, over the years that will be recognized and people will see the authenticity in the message. So in a way, going back to the basics and to the most classic Unicef is the thing that makes us show up in the most contemporary way.
Thank you.
You're welcome. It's a great question.
Okay, so our next question is going to be from Zoe.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Mila. I was so impressed by your story from Wikimedia to Unicef.
Thank you.
I'm just curious about because as a designer, we're trained to be creative and to be make more things happen. I'm just curious about, because you transfer from a designer's job to a more design leadership.
Yeah.
So what do you think is the most important for this mindset changing and to make this happen?
Well, I'm not a designer. I just want to clarify that. I'm a strategist. But I do work, like you say, as a design leader many times. I think you have to it's a great question. I feel like when you're going maybe less from the making to the directing, I think first you have to make a lot of work to know how to make it well. And I think about that way even as a strategist, have all those basics. But then I think when you get to more of a design leader position, I think it's about, what I try to do always is to keep the teams focused. At the end of the day, what are we looking to achieve? And sometimes that in a pitch can be as simple as always keeping the brief nearby. And when you go and explore all sorts of ideas, going back to wait a minute, this is what we're really looking to do. So I try to always keep the teams focused on what we agreed was the goal. But I think the second one is to be, as a design leader, I think you have to be open to surprises. And you have to be open that your team will have ideas that maybe are much better than yours. And I feel like that, creating a safe space for exploration, where everybody, there's so many stories about how the best ideas came to life and how it was something that somebody had scribbled and had thrown away in a piece of paper. So I feel like creating those safe spaces where we all trust each other and you're able to explore. And I think as a design leader, you have to be a little bit egoless and make sure that you're channeling all the best talent from your team. I love to assemble teams that are very different and that are very multidisciplinary. I think what I loved about the Wikipedia work is that we had a team that was so varied. We had designers, we had writers, we had strategists in very different proportions at very different times. And it made the work so rich. So I think as a design leader, you're always like, I think it's like understanding what the ask is, and then secondly, combining teams that are incredibly different amongst themselves and creating like this fun, safe space where people can be really vulnerable and they can, come up with really, different ideas and iterate very quickly. I think those are the two key things.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, so for our next question, we're going to have Alyssa.
Mm-hmm.
Hi.
Hi,
I
Lisa.
was really impressed by how global your work is. I was wondering if you had any advice for how brands and companies can be less American-centric and Western-centric.
That's a great question. I mean, I was a researcher for many, many years, a market researcher at eBay and then also here at American Express in New York. I feel like the very first thing you need to do is to understanding your users is always so important. So making sure that you run like global research, that you talk to users across the world. So you have to start there. Start really understanding, it's a very obvious thing, but start really understanding the people you're serving in its most varied and like diverse expression. So pick markets that are different. Sometimes you can't run research in all the countries in the world, but pick 5 or 7 that are really different and that are gonna really pull things apart. And I think what you'll get there is that you'll very quickly be able to establish the commonalities, like what are the big universal truths that apply to everyone, like you saw, for example, in Wikipedia, set knowledge free, or in Unicef for every child. Those are big human truths that apply everywhere, but you're also going to understand all the different nuances, and you're really going to understand, you always have to have like a global message, if you will, but you have to deliver it in a way that's locally relevant. So I would always start there, like doing some great global research and picking countries that are as different as possible. Have a management team that's not only American, right? And have people from different parts of the world and who are fluent in different languages. Huge. Like English is such a fantastic language for marketing, but I'm a native Spanish speaker. Whenever I translate anything into Spanish, it's destroyed immediately, right? So have people who speak different languages and who are going to be able to look at the work as they're making it. And then the final thing is, always have internal stakeholders. For example, we are looking to revamp our brand book at Unicef this year. We're super excited about it. So we started the process with this, brand audit where we picked 7 countries, 1 from each region, and we went super deep on their digital feeds, and we looked at how the brand is showing up all over their digital feeds. It was excruciating work with a lot of detail, looking at the logo and the colors and the fonts and the illustration and everything. But when we did that, we really found a great sense of the gaps. And then we had interviews with all of those teams, and we really unpacked everything. And it was so helpful because, for example, we identified just how different the teams are. Like there are people who have 5 designers, many, many teams at Unicef. The person who's like running the Instagram account is a journalist who's also doing press releases. They're doing 5 jobs at the same time. So understanding, it was so helpful. But what we're doing with those folks too is we're keeping them close. And as we're developing new versions of the brand book, they are our testers. So we go back to them. So having sort of that consultation process that, keeps us, sort of like helps us deliver on the work and make sure that it's globally relevant is incredibly important. But I think it's all about like, for me, and that's like the common thread of my work, whether it's the private sector or the nonprofit sector, and it's an obvious thing. And they will tell you all the time, but we don't do it enough. Like focus on the end user and really talk to the people who are using your product and make those people as different as possible. I think that's the best we can do.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so for our next question, we're going to have one from Mimi.
These are all excellent questions, by the way.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak with us. I was wondering how your background in economics and business and management consulting has influenced your job as a brand strategist now.
Yeah. For me, I think it was like, in a weird way, it was a really good education to brand strategy because I did that first then I did market research, and then I sort of found brand strategy. I kind of think I always approach the projects from the first thing I try to understand is the organizational strategy, and really understand, like, can I see the strategic plan? Can I see what you're looking to achieve? What are your KPIs? So I think that comes a little bit from that training, if I'm trying to like understand an organization's objectives. And then sort of my background as a market researcher interfaces really nicely, because then I'm also trying to understand the end user. But in a way, I think it was a great way of entering the field. First, because it helped me to, be very comfortable analyzing, exploring an organization's business plan, for example, and understanding what they're looking to achieve. I think, for example, in the field of brand architecture, which is it's the bread and butter of many branding agencies, having a background in management consulting is really helpful, because there you're really looking at, it's the business plan coming to life and really understanding, the strategy, et cetera, et cetera. So in a strange way, I feel like that has always helped me. So I think, and over the years, I would encourage all of you to kind of like, go where your curiosity takes you, and not be afraid to mix different things. I feel like, I was talking earlier for you guys, I feel like your generation, you guys are much more like, fluent in different disciplines, and you can do tons of things, but like, sometimes those things that feel different actually combine together very nicely, and go a little bit where your curiosity takes you, because I feel like that will chart a really interesting path.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so our next question is going to be from Zoe.
Mm-hmm. Hi.
I was particularly inspired by the way branding and design can be used to empower and advance these incredibly big and important global justice issues. So I'm curious, what was the biggest difference transitioning from big corporate environments to working under nonprofit, still large but massive institutions?
Yeah.
And perhaps what your personal motivations for this change might have been?
Yeah, totally. My personal motivation was very much like the state of the world that we find ourselves in. And I do think business can do a lot and can affect a lot of positive social change. But I was really like at a moment in my career where I wasn't as interested or as motivated by briefs that were about like selling stuff. I wanted to see, how can you use these tools from the for-profit world to make something, that helps sort of humanity move forward in another way. It is very different, and it is not always easy. And like you say, it's a UNICEF is still a huge, large institution. We have 14,000 employees, and we're 75 years old. I mean, it's a tanker. But I believe that it's a very obvious thing, but like, organizations are people, and the only way we're going to transform institutions is that if people like you join them. So I would encourage all of you to like find some type of like public service experience. They come in many shapes and forms. They're all valid. They're all helpful in some way. You don't have to choose one. You can try different things. But it is super different. I feel like at UNICEF, I have to listen twice as much. I mean, that idea that you have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that you listen twice as much, I feel like I need to apply that every day. The context is so different, and each point is so valid. And I feel like, above all, like a nonprofit brand it's 2 things. I think one is we are really, our key sort of attribute as a brand is trust. So I'm very aware of like the reputational risk to the brand. When you think about it, like UNICEF, like governments trust us with the health, with the education of their children, and donors trust us with their funds. These are pretty big things, right? So I feel like I'm always just very careful and try to evaluate as much of a cool idea that we can have. Like, is it really helpful? And is it really going to serve the teams that are working? I think, like, for example, sometimes we have to like make the ideas much, much simpler, or just so that they are able to adapt. I think we're looking a lot for reach and for an idea that works for everyone. And sometimes you sacrifice a little bit of depth or fidelity, but for us, we're trying to get to as many countries as possible. And I think like for us in the for-profit sector, you're always looking about consumer needs, and you're trying to sort of like give them what they need and please them in a way. And I think in the nonprofit sector, I think we're always thinking about protecting the dignity of the people we serve and making work that's truly helpful for them, and not necessarily that glorifies the brand. I feel like we always try to recede a little bit whenever we can. So it's a really delicate balance, and I almost feel like I need to look at each activation or each problem that's put in front of us and really think about the audience differently and the goals, because they're all super different. So almost like treading very carefully. I think it's maybe over the years I will become more comfortable in the space, but I still tread very, very carefully because I think it's sort of a huge responsibility.
Okay, so another question that we have received is, how does your personal brand interplay with Unicef's brand?
That's a great question. That's a great question. I feel like that's something that you're always kind of working on, but I think it goes back to like Wally's idea. You have to understand yourself and see who you are, what makes you different. It's very obvious, but it's not easy. And be a little bit unapologetic about that. I feel like, for example, if you're somebody who's like, and my boss is incredible in that way, if you're somebody who's spontaneous and who's a straight shooter, and be that way, you know? So I feel like at Unicef, I try to like, if I'm trying to like unpack sort of like, what's the personal brand, or how am I trying to show up for people, I'm trying to show up as somebody who's listening to them, who's empathetic, who's thinking about their needs. And also very proud about, like, you know, having grown up in a lot of places, speaking different languages, and really being someone who's been immersed in many different cultures. But I have to say, it is a place that's very welcoming, because we have people from many, many different parts of the world. Everybody shows up in such a different way, whether it's, you know, the way they dress, the way they speak. And also, I feel like it's really interesting because I feel like there's many different avenues that bring you to a nonprofit role. So I really love about the culture too. There's people who are about, you know, social justice. There's people who are, you know, come from the Peace Corps. There's people from all sorts of avenues that are really coming together, and they bring sort of like a little bit of their special flavor. But I think in that way, at least Unicef is a super welcoming place where we really like just love seeing how different everyone is. And I think that's, a friend of mine says it the other day, and I thought it was, it's no cliche, like nobody is like you, so bring that to work, and you will contribute a ton, especially if you're working on a very complex, large global brand.
Okay, our next question will be from Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. My question was, when working with UNICEF, how important is it for you to stay in line with, when you have a parent organization like the United Nations, to stay in line with their branding? And how important is it to also kind of break off and have your own personal UNICEF brand?
This is a great question, and it's very relevant right now. So it's very interesting. We have our sort of own independent brand since the beginning. And we are funded very differently from the United Nations. The United Nations is our parent organization, if you will, but UNICEF relies exclusively on voluntary donations. No country is obliged to contribute to UNICEF, so we almost have to reinvent the wheel all the time to be funded. So UNICEF has always had like a very unique and differentiated brand from the United Nations. But there are always times where, for example, we work together. Right now, we're working a lot with UNHCR in Ukraine to support the Ukraine emergency. And in some countries, Sometimes, for example, last year doing the whole COVAX rollout, we worked with a lot of UN agencies. So we have very sort of clear guidelines within our brand book on how we partner with the UN, with other UN agencies, and with a ton of partner organizations that we work with. But it's a really interesting question, and I think what we try to do, for example, is, again, being very end-user driven. How can we leverage the brand that has the highest recognition for people? And UNICEF is amongst like the top 5 brands in the nonprofit sector. So we don't want to confuse people. We want to, make it as easy as possible for them to find us. But it's something that we sort of pay close attention to, and more in really complex, large-scale emergencies, we have to partner with them a lot, for sure. Thank you.
Lovely. So that will be our final question. Thank you so much,
Thank
Mila.
you all.
Thank you.